There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when everything stops working the way it used to. The distractions lose their effect. The noise no longer drowns anything out. Even the routines that once kept you stable begin to feel mechanical, hollow. And in that silence, something begins to surface. At first it is subtle, a faint discomfort, a tension you cannot quite name. You try to ignore it, like you have ignored so many things before. You reach for your phone, for conversation, for anything that can pull you away from it. And for a while, it works, but it always comes back, stronger, closer, more precise. It does not ask for your attention, it demands it. You begin to notice it in unexpected places, in moments that should feel normal, in conversations that once felt effortless. There is a weight beneath everything now, something unresolved, something watching quietly from within. And no matter how far you run, it follows. This is where the discomfort becomes unsettling. Because what if this feeling is not random? What if it is not a flaw in your mind, but a message? A signal that something within you has been ignored for too long. Most people never reach this point consciously. They remain occupied, constantly moving, constantly consuming, never stopping long enough to notice what is happening beneath the surface. But if you are here, if you feel this, then something has already begun. The question is no longer whether the pain exists. The question is why it refuses to leave, and more disturbingly, what it is trying to show you. Carl Jung did not look at the human mind the way most thinkers of his time did. Where others sought order, he turned toward what was hidden. Where others trusted reason, he questioned what lay beneath it. He was not interested in the version of the self that people presented to the world. He was drawn to what they avoided, the parts they buried, denied, or refused to acknowledge. In an age that celebrated rational control, Jung suggested something far less comfortable, that the human mind is not fully known to itself, and more importantly, that what is unknown does not remain silent. His work revolved around a simple but unsettling idea. What we suppress does not disappear, it accumulates, it distorts, and eventually it returns, not as clarity, but as tension, anxiety, and pain. For Jung, suffering was not merely a malfunction of the mind, it was communication, a signal from the unconscious pressing against the boundaries of awareness. This is what makes his ideas difficult to ignore, because if pain is not accidental, then it is not meaningless either. And if it carries meaning, then the question is no longer how to escape it, but why it exists at all. There is a quiet assumption most people carry without ever examining it, that they are in control. Control over their thoughts, control over their emotions, control over the direction of their lives. This belief is rarely questioned because it is rarely challenged, at least not on the surface. Life appears structured, decisions are made, routines are followed, identities are maintained. Everything seems to move within a predictable order. But beneath this appearance, something begins to fracture. Control, it turns out, is often a performance, a carefully constructed sense of stability built on habits, distractions, and unexamined beliefs. People learn how to present themselves, how to behave, how to align with expectations, both their own and those imposed by the world around them. And over time, this constructed version of the self becomes indistinguishable from who they believe they are. But it is not complete. There are thoughts that do not fit the image, emotions that feel inappropriate, inconvenient, or unacceptable, impulses that contradict the identity they have built. These elements are not integrated, they are managed, suppressed, pushed out of awareness. And this is where the illusion begins to weaken, because what is excluded does not vanish. It remains active, operating beneath the surface, shaping behavior in ways that are not immediately visible. The more rigid the sense of control becomes, the more pressure builds beneath it. Eventually, something slips, a reaction that feels disproportionate, a feeling that cannot be explained, a sense of unease that appears without a clear cause. This is often where people become confused. They believe something has gone wrong. But what if nothing has gone wrong? What if this disruption is not the breakdown of control, but the exposure of its limits? The modern world offers a solution to discomfort that is both immediate and effective: distraction. Endless streams of information, constant stimulation, a continuous flow of content designed to occupy attention. At any given moment, there is always something to consume, something to respond to, something to engage with. Silence has become optional, reflection avoidable. And for a time, this works. The tension fades into the background. The unease becomes less noticeable. The mind, occupied with external input, has little space left to turn inward. But the absence of awareness is not the absence of activity. Beneath the noise, something continues. Thoughts that are not fully processed do not disappear. Emotions that are not acknowledged do not resolve themselves. They remain active, circulating below the threshold of conscious attention. Sigmund Freud described this dynamic as repression, the mind's attempt to push uncomfortable material out of awareness. But repression is not erasure, it is containment, and containment is unstable, because what is held down does not remain passive, it exerts pressure, it seeks expression. This is why distraction has limits. The more one relies on external noise to avoid internal discomfort, the more fragile the silence becomes. Eventually, there are moments when distraction fails, when the noise stops, even briefly. And in those moments, the underlying tension returns with greater intensity. It no longer feels like a vague discomfort. It feels precise, directed, almost intentional. This is where the experience becomes difficult to ignore, because the feeling is no longer just present. It is persistent. It interrupts. It resurfaces. It refuses to remain contained. And the more one tries to suppress it, the more it adapts, emerging as restlessness, anxiety, or an undefined sense of dissatisfaction. The conflict becomes clear. Avoidance does not eliminate what is avoided. It amplifies it. There are aspects of the self that people accept without hesitation. The traits that align with their identity, their values, their sense of who they are. And then there are the others, the impulses that feel unacceptable, the thoughts that contradict the image they maintain, the emotions that do not fit the narrative they have constructed. These are not simply ignored, they are rejected. Carl Jung referred to this collection of disowned qualities as the shadow, not because it is inherently negative, but because it exists outside the field of awareness, unseen, yet constantly present. The shadow is not passive. It influences perception, shapes reactions, and directs behavior in subtle but significant ways. It appears in moments of contradiction, when actions do not align with intentions, when responses feel disproportionate, when judgments toward others seem unusually intense. Often, what is rejected within is recognized externally. Traits that provoke strong reactions in others, arrogance, insecurity, aggression, are frequently reflections of something unacknowledged within the self. This is what makes the shadow difficult to confront. It challenges identity. To recognize it is to admit that the self is not as coherent, not as controlled, not as defined as it appears. It introduces complexity where simplicity once existed. And this complexity is uncomfortable because it requires a shift from seeing oneself as a fixed identity to understanding oneself as a dynamic, often contradictory process. Pain emerges at this boundary, not as punishment, but as friction, the tension between what is accepted and what is denied. The more rigid the identity, the stronger this tension becomes. And the more one resists acknowledging the shadow, the more forcefully it asserts itself, through behavior, through emotion, through the very discomfort one tries to escape. At some point, the question is no longer whether the shadow exists. It is whether one is willing to see it. There comes a point where the structure begins to fail, Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The identity that once felt stable begins to lose its coherence. The roles that once provided direction start to feel restrictive. The sense of purpose that once seemed clear becomes uncertain. What once held everything together no longer does. This is often experienced as exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper. A fatigue that does not resolve with rest. A sense that effort no longer produces the same results. That the systems one relied on are no longer functioning as they used to. And beneath this fatigue, there is something else. A quiet realization that the life being lived may not be fully aligned with what is internally true. Friedrich Nietzsche suggested that individuals often construct meaning to avoid confronting the absence of it. They build frameworks, beliefs, goals, identities, not necessarily because they are true, but because they provide structure. But what happens when that structure begins to collapse? When the justifications no longer hold? When the narrative no longer convinces? This is where the mask begins to crack. The version of the self that was carefully maintained starts to reveal its limitations. It becomes clear that much of what was believed to be authentic was, in part, constructed, shaped by expectation, by fear, by the need for coherence. This realization is not liberating. It is destabilizing, because it removes certainty without replacing it. And in that absence, the underlying tension becomes impossible to ignore. The discomfort intensifies, not because something new has appeared, but because what was hidden is now closer to the surface, closer than it has ever been. Pain as a signal, not a symptom. Section 5, approximately 350 words. Up to this point, pain has been treated as something to resolve, a problem to fix, a disturbance to eliminate, a flaw in the system. But this perspective assumes that pain is the issue. What if it is not? Carl Jung approached suffering differently. He did not see it as awareness, when it begins, is rarely stable. There are moments, brief, often uncomfortable, where something becomes clear. A pattern is recognized, a contradiction is seen. The structure of one's own behavior becomes visible in a way it was not before. And then, just as quickly, it fades. Not because the insight was false, but because it was difficult to sustain. To remain aware requires something most people are not prepared for: the willingness to dismantle what feels familiar. Identity, even when flawed, provides stability. It defines roles. It offers direction. It creates a sense of continuity. To question it is to risk disorientation. This is why most people retreat. They return to what is known, not because it is accurate, but because it is comfortable. The discomfort of truth is replaced with the familiarity of illusion. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that human beings are not primarily driven by truth, but by the avoidance of suffering. And if truth introduces discomfort, it is often rejected, even when it is recognized. This is the cycle. Moments of clarity followed by retreat. Recognition followed by avoidance. Awareness followed by distraction. Pain persists, not because it is hidden, but because it is resisted. And resistance over time becomes habitual, until the individual no longer notices the pattern. They return to the surface and remain there, not because there is nothing beneath, but because looking beneath requires more than awareness. It requires confrontation. There is a point where the movement slows, not because everything has been resolved, but because something has been recognized, something that cannot be easily dismissed. The noise no longer fully distracts. The routines no longer fully convince. The identity no longer fully holds. And in that space, there is a kind of stillness, not peaceful, but attentive. The pain is still there, but it is different now. Less like an intrusion, more like a presence. Something that does not demand immediate reaction, but does not allow indifference either. It remains. Not louder, not softer, just clearer. And with that clarity comes a shift in perception. The discomfort that once felt like an obstacle begins to feel deliberate. Not in the sense that it was chosen, but in the sense that it is precise, targeted. It appears exactly where something is unresolved, where something does not align, where something has been ignored, and it does not generalize. It focuses. This is what makes it difficult to escape. Because it is not everywhere, it is specific. It points, but it does not explain. There is no voice attached to it, no clear instruction, no direct meaning, only a sensation that something is not as it should be. And the longer it is observed, the more difficult it becomes to dismiss it as random, because randomness does not persist with such consistency. It does not adapt. It does not return in different forms, in different moments, with the same underlying tension. Pain does, which raises a question that is not easily answered. If this experience is not accidental, if it is not meaningless, if it is not simply a malfunction, then what is it? And more importantly, what happens if it stops? There is an assumption that the absence of pain would be relief, that without it, everything would return to normal. But what if normal is exactly what allowed it to emerge in the first place? What if the absence of pain is not resolution, but silence, not clarity, but absence? Because if pain is the only thing that interrupts the pattern, the only thing that reveals the inconsistency, the only thing that resists the illusion, then removing it without understanding it may not restore anything. It may only remove the interruption. And without interruption, the structure remains unchallenged, unexamined, intact. This is where the tension remains, not in the presence of pain, but in its implication. Because to follow it is to move towards something uncertain, something undefined, something that does not guarantee resolution. But to ignore it is to remain where everything appears stable, and nothing is fully understood. And in that space, the question does not disappear. It waits, quietly, persistently, unanswered,